Okay, I've inked in my preliminary study and I'm ready to shade it. But before I do, I'm going to Xerox it 2 times so that I can create 2 different versions of my sketch. These are called value studies. So I always do 2, 3 sometimes. This gives me a chance to play with the values a little bit. Also, it's really important so that I'm able to take risks, because I think sometimes when you shade directly on your preliminary study, you're so worried about screwing up that you tend to make conservative choices. So by Xeroxing these, I can take really big, bold decisions and not worry that I'm going to mess up, because if I do, I'll just Xerox another one, or I've got a second version. So I'll show you how to do these in a second, the technique we're going to use. But before we do, let's think about the different ways we can approach the general value scheme in our composition. So these 3 fairly rough studies represent the 3 different ways I can arrange my values in my composition. So I've scanned my preliminary study, I've zoomed it down, scaled it down, and then printed it up in this format. This is actually a really useful intermediary step between the preliminary study and the value study. So if you feel a little bit timid about doing the value studies, this might be a good choice. These were done with a few Copic markers. I believe these, what is this? Yeah, so a couple of different grays. Okay, so let's talk about the different value schemes. Scheme number 1 is one where the background is generally darker than my area of focus, the 2 weavers and the king. So this one has a dark background. Dark against light. This one represents the reverse, where the background's really, really light, and then the foreground figures are generally darker against the background. Not quite silhouetted. I generally don't do that, except for maybe some elements of the foreground. But this represents the reverse. So this is dark against lighter value. And the third represents a middle tone, where our areas of interest, our foreground, middle ground, are both lighter and darker than the background. So let's break these down really quickly once again. In the first value scheme, it's dark background with light area of focus. Background's dark, and then our area of focus, our weavers and our king, are lighter. Yes, when you're doing value studies, it's really, really important to identify where the area of focus is, and make sure that your strongest contrast is there. So I'm taking the opportunity to make the beard on the king a little bit darker so that I can pull attention here. Now, I'm probably not going to make the crown darker. I'm probably going to make it lighter here. So this is a little bit of a mistake that is probably not going to be there. Okay, so this is light background against a darker area of focus. So most of my area of focus is a little bit darker than the background. And then this one represents 50% gray in the background, with the area of focus being both lighter and darker. So this is mid-tone with lighter and darker values. Now, there's obviously other things to think about. There's light direction, the way cast shadows fall, whether that's going to be realistic at all. But anytime I am doing a value study, I'm thinking about these 3 different schemes. And usually when I do value studies, besides thinking about, oh, okay, light's coming from here in this one and coming from the bottom in this one, I'm thinking about what is the general overall value scheme. Chances are it's going to fall into one of these 3 categories. Darker background, lighter foreground, area of focus, lighter background, light background with, excuse me, this should say darker area of focus. Up. Darker area of focus, or mid-tone with both lighter and darker values in the area of focus. So in the next tutorial, I'm going to show you how to tone these and how to create value studies on top of these copies. Okay, let's do a value study. Here are the materials we're going to need. You're going to need a stick of extra soft compressed charcoal. It's really important to use this stuff because really nothing else other than extra soft compressed charcoal is going to work quite as well. So have a stick of extra soft compressed charcoal. Have some charcoal pencils or carbon pencils. These are Wolff's carbon pencils. I'll list the materials underneath the tutorial for you guys. The reason why I prefer these over the charcoal is that they're a little bit stickier, they go a little bit darker, and for these smaller preliminary value studies, it allows me to get a little bit more detail, just a little bit sharper than a regular charcoal pencil. What else? Well, it'll help to have a few blending stumps to get smoother, faster shading. Definitely just one or two will do. And then you're going to need some kind of eraser holder. Maybe one of these, or one of these. They come in different sizes. Some eraser holders, and also a kneaded eraser would be also really helpful to erase out large areas, make value adjustments. And then to smear down the extra soft compressed charcoal, you're going to need one of these. This is a chamois cloth. It's not this color in the store. It's usually kind of a tan color or maybe a lighter version of this. You're going to need it to blend down your charcoal. Really nothing else works quite as well. It's a soft piece of leather. It works really well, also as an eraser, but also as a applier of tone. So here's how this works. You're going to take your compressed charcoal, smear your paper with it. See now why I asked you guys to really put down a heavy line in your preliminary study. Otherwise, your drawing would get entirely lost. And this has happened many a time with my students, where they do a really careful, really detailed preliminary study with really fine lines. They Xerox it, and then they realize, oh my gosh, well, I have to go back and re-ink my preliminary study so that it actually shows up in a Xerox. Okay, I'm looking for about a 50% tone, but it depends, because if my ultimate value scheme is going to be kind of dark, kind of gloomy, it might benefit you to actually tone this darker. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do value scheme number 1. That'll be dark background with lighter values in the foreground. Let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to start off, in this case, with a slightly darker tone. Now, don't go too dark. You're going to end up having to erase out a lot. It's just going to be a lot of work. Don't worry about these streaks, these bumps. Look, they're coming through from the paper underneath. I'm not really concerned. Though I could probably rub them out. Let me see if I can do it. Yeah, I can. Okay. Ready to do my preliminary study. Work big to small. Think about big stuff and little by little work towards the little stuff. What's the big stuff? Well, we've got a dark background. Let's make the background dark. I do these value studies regardless of the medium I'm using. So whether I'm doing watercolor or I'm doing a graphite drawing, not that I do illustrations with graphite, but let's say I did. Regardless of the medium, I think it really helps to do these value studies in charcoal. Why? Because they allow me to go as dark as I need to. I can make very, very quick and also very subtle value adjustments if I want to. It's just a very, very flexible technique. So now I'm going to use my blending stumps to go darker this way. This might need a few layers. So let's go a little bit darker here. By the way, if I need to cover a large area, I can use a stick of charcoal for that also. Okay, so I'm going to make the background dark. I can start thinking about light direction. Okay guys, I have a separate tutorial on how to shade out of your head. out of your imagination. So look for it in the illustration playlist. But for right now, what I'm thinking about is what are the simple shapes underneath? Where's the light coming from? How would they be lit? So I'm going to do a light coming from the center of the composition, kind of like I had in my value scheme, where we had some kind of lamp, lantern coming from here, and light is fanning out in all directions. I think that's going to be really dramatic. It's going to do a really nice job illuminating all the things that I think are important in this composition. So what I'm doing is I'm finding my light breaks. I'm thinking about what forms are going to be casting a shadow. I'm trying to be accurate. However, that's what reference is for. So really, once I decide what my values need to be through the value study, I'm going to get more reference. So I'm not going to stress at this stage if I don't get it exactly right. I'm going to try. I want to get as close as possible. But if I don't, I'll fix it with a reference. Alright, so maybe there'll be a little bit of light catching here. I don't want things to get entirely lost in the shadow, but whenever you have a dark illustration, sometimes these lost edges can be kind of important, so this figure kind of appearing from the darkness. That said, I am thinking about visual clarity. I don't want anything to get lost in my image. I'm also thinking about visual hierarchy. Where is the most important part of my story? Am I using my values effectively to define that area? To make sure that the viewer looks there first. This, after all, is storytelling. And when you're telling a story, you have to prioritize your information. So when I'm telling some kind of story, usually I don't spend a tremendous amount of time building it up. I build it up, I spark the viewer's interest, imagination, and then I get to the point. Right? The build-up in the story, in which case the build-up in the story shouldn't be more important than the story itself, let's put it this way. So all this stuff, the background, the secondary details, is really build-up. There are secondary details that either set the scene or move the eye in the direction of the area of focus. They shouldn't overwhelm, they shouldn't dominate the area of focus. That's a really important principle. Point being, I am going to have some strong lights and darks on this character here, but where are my strongest lights and darks? They're going to be on the king. I really feel like the king is central to the story, the main part of the story anyway. I'm not going to let the weavers take over, and in fact, compositionally, the weavers are really meant to lead the eye into the composition effectively. That's really the way I've designed the composition. Okay, so I'm going to have this weaver appearing out of the shadows. Okay, so I'm going to work a little bit more on this so you can see what the finished result is, and then we'll move on and do another one. Okay, this is pretty rough, but as you can see, I chose the first of my value schemes with a darker background and the figures being relatively lighter. In these kind of really dark, moody, gloomy illustrations, visual clarity is really important, so make sure that nothing gets lost. This figure that's almost in silhouette, I want to make sure that I pick out some details to figure out, well, maybe there's some kind of secondary light, a filling in the shadows so that things don't get entirely lost. That said, sometimes having figures emerge from the darkness can be very effective in this value scheme. So the background here could go darker, but I think you get a sense of where the light is falling, the general value scheme in the situation. Under normal conditions, I would keep working on this, resolve it a little bit more before moving to the final sketch. However, time is short. Let's move on to the next one. Here is our second value scale, value study. Now, the objective should be to do a value study that is as different from the first one as possible, so you have a range of options to choose from. This one doesn't particularly interest me. Like usually, I don't know, I find lighter backgrounds with darker areas of focus perhaps not as interesting. I tend to gravitate, and I think most illustrators will tend to gravitate towards this one, where the background is generally mid-toned and the foreground elements, area of focus, are both lighter and darker. This tends to be the more traditional option, though this is very common with Rembrandt and Georges de Latour, the Tenebrist movement, Caravaggio, who invented the whole thing. Let's go with this one. I think there's most potential. Will I stay with this light direction? I'm not sure. I don't particularly like the fact that this guy's face is in shadow. I really want the weavers to be visible. These are sneaky faces. Maybe there's a way to define the face and keep the same light direction. Let's see. Let's take a look. Okay, again pretty rough, but here's another value study. In this case, I changed the light direction from my first concept, but you can see the principle is the same. I start off with a mid-tone. I tone the paper a little bit lighter than the first one, which I toned pretty dark. And then I changed the light direction so that it was flooding in from the right side, throwing this guy into silhouette, but most importantly, illuminating the head of the king and the head of this weaver. What else can I say about this? I'm still thinking about area of focus, so I definitely am making the king the most important part. I'm trying not to throw stronger values into the weavers or the soldiers or the background, and also including a really dark beard, which I had in the first one as well. So once I've got my two value studies, this one and this one, I look at them, I decide which one to go with. I really like this one. It is very, very dramatic. However, in terms of storytelling, this one is perhaps a little bit too dark in mood. This might be some kind of gothic story, The Emperor's New Skin, something like that. Whereas this one is perhaps a little bit more lighthearted, playful, which is basically, I think, the general theme of the story, the general mood of the story, even though it has some very deep satirical content. So I'm going to go with this one. From here, I'm going to start gathering reference, which means I'm going to take photos of absolutely everything I think I need to have in this image. Now, I already have photos of the archaeological stuff. Okay, this column is from absolutely nowhere, but clothing, all that kind of stuff. But for the figures, I'm going to find models or hire myself, pose myself in the poses that I want, get exactly the lighting that I want, get the reference, and then do a finished, fully rendered, fully detailed sketch that represents everything I plan to include in the painting. That's the next step in the process. So I'll show you how to do that. I'm not going to show you how to photograph. You guys should be able to do that on your own. But I'm going to show you my reference gathering process, and then hopefully if I have time, I'll do a sketch for you.